The millionaire froze in the doorway when he saw the cleaner kneeling beside his son's wheelchair, her arms stretched out as if shielding the boy from someone who had already walked away, and in that quiet second something inside him shifted because he realized this was not the first time she had done it. The house was large and silent, the kind of home that looked perfect from the outside but often felt empty inside: marble floors, tall windows, expensive furniture, yet the only real sound that mattered there was the soft voice of a 12-year-old boy named Daniel who could not walk and rarely left his wheelchair. His father, Victor Hale, was one of the richest men in the city, a man who owned construction companies, hotels, and media businesses, a man people described as powerful, confident, and impossible to challenge. But inside his home things were not as simple as the newspapers believed. Victor Hale had lost his wife years ago in a tragic accident, and since that day the relationship between him and his son had slowly grown distant, not because he did not love the boy, but because grief had built a quiet wall between them. Daniel had been injured in the same accident that took his mother, leaving his legs permanently damaged, and ever since that day the boy had lived a life surrounded by nurses, tutors, and assistants, yet strangely he often seemed lonelier than anyone Victor had ever known. The cleaner's name was Elena, a quiet woman who had started working in the house less than a year earlier. She arrived early every morning, cleaned the halls, the rooms, the windows, and almost nobody paid attention to her. The house staff rarely spoke to her except when giving instructions. Some of them even whispered that she was too quiet, too serious, almost invisible. Victor himself had barely noticed her during the first months. To him she was simply part of the staff, someone who kept the house tidy while he spent most of his days in meetings and business calls. But slowly something unusual began to happen. Victor started hearing laughter in the garden in the afternoons, something rare in that quiet mansion. At first he assumed the nurses were entertaining Daniel. But one evening he walked past the open window and saw something unexpected. Elena was sitting on the grass beside Daniel's wheelchair, showing him how to fold small paper birds from pieces of colored paper. The boy was smiling widely, the kind of smile Victor had not seen on his face in years. Victor did not interrupt. He simply stood there watching silently for a moment, confused by the scene. The next day he noticed something else. Daniel asked the nurse if Elena could stay a little longer in the garden because he wanted to finish a drawing. The nurse looked surprised but agreed. Victor began to notice more small moments like that. Elena quietly adjusting the blanket on Daniel's legs when the evening air became cold. Elena bringing the boy a book from the library when he said he was bored. Elena pushing his wheelchair slowly through the garden path while explaining the names of flowers. It was strange because none of those things were technically part of her job. The nurses were responsible for the boy. The tutors handled his education. Yet somehow Elena had become the one person Daniel waited for every afternoon. At first Victor did not think much about it. If his son was happier, that was good. But then one afternoon something happened that changed everything. Victor had returned home earlier than usual. As he walked through the corridor he heard raised voices coming from the garden. One voice belonged to the head nurse, a strict woman named Mrs. Collins who had worked for the family for years. The other voice was Elena's, but quieter, almost pleading. Victor stepped closer and saw the scene clearly. Mrs. Collins was standing beside Daniel's wheelchair, scolding the boy harshly for spilling juice on his shirt. The boy looked frightened and silent. Elena was standing between them, her hands slightly raised as if protecting him. He didn't do it on purpose, Elena said softly. Mrs. Collins looked furious. You are the cleaner, she snapped, stay out of this. Daniel's hands trembled slightly on the armrest of the wheelchair. Elena did not move away. She stayed there calmly, blocking Mrs. Collins from getting closer to the boy. Victor felt a sudden surge of anger but he stayed hidden for a moment longer, watching. Mrs. Collins shook her head in disgust. You think you know better than the professionals, she said coldly. You're here to clean floors, nothing more. Elena lowered her eyes but did not step aside. He is just a child, she said quietly. Mrs. Collins turned away angrily and walked toward the house. Only then did Elena kneel beside Daniel and gently wipe the juice from his shirt with a napkin. The boy looked at her with trust that surprised Victor deeply. That was the moment Victor had frozen in the doorway earlier that day. Something about the scene felt strange, deeper than a simple act of kindness. Later that evening Victor asked Daniel about Elena. The boy smiled softly and said something that made Victor pause. "She always makes sure nobody shouts at me when you're not here," he said. Victor frowned slightly. "Nobody should be shouting at you," he replied. Daniel looked down at his hands and stayed silent. That silence planted a quiet seed of concern in Victor's mind. Over the next few days he began paying closer attention. He noticed that Elena always stayed near Daniel when certain staff members were around. He noticed that she watched the nurses carefully. He noticed that Daniel seemed calmer whenever she was nearby. Finally Victor decided to speak with her directly. He found Elena in the kitchen late one evening, quietly washing cups. She looked surprised when he entered. Victor studied her face for a moment. "Why are you protecting my son?" he asked calmly. Elena's hands froze in the water. For a moment she did not answer. Then she slowly dried her hands on a towel. "I'm not protecting him," she said quietly. "I'm just being kind." Victor shook his head. "No," he said softly. "There is more to it." Elena looked down at the floor. Her silence lasted several seconds. Then she whispered something that made Victor's heart tighten. "Because I know what happens when nobody protects a child like him." Victor's voice grew serious. "What do you mean?" Elena looked up slowly. There was pain in her eyes that had clearly been there for many years. "I had a son," she said softly. "He was disabled too." Victor felt the air grow heavy. Elena continued slowly, choosing each word carefully. "He was in a care facility when I had to work long hours. I trusted the staff. I believed they were kind." Her voice trembled slightly. "But they weren't." Victor's chest tightened. Elena's eyes filled with quiet tears. "By the time I discovered how they treated him, it was too late." The kitchen fell silent. Victor could hardly breathe. "He died 2 years ago," she whispered. "And I promised myself that if I ever saw another child being treated like that, I would never stay silent again." Victor stood there stunned, unable to speak. In that moment the terrifying truth became clear. Elena was not simply protecting Daniel from one angry nurse. She had recognized the early signs of neglect and cruelty that others ignored. And she had stepped in quietly, patiently, every single day. The next morning Victor called the entire household staff into the living room. His voice was calm but firm. "From today forward," he said, "the care of my son will be monitored by independent specialists." Mrs. Collins tried to protest, but Victor raised his hand. "And Elena," he continued, turning toward her, "is no longer the cleaner." The room fell silent. Daniel looked confused. Victor walked toward Elena slowly. "From today you will be my son's personal caregiver." Elena stared at him in shock. Victor looked at her with deep gratitude. "Because you were the only person in this house who protected him when nobody was watching." Daniel smiled brightly from his wheelchair. And for the first time in many years, the silent mansion finally felt like a home again.